Franny here from Kit Guru, and today I'm taking a look at the GAMEMAX Kallis gaming case. This case is definitely a budget case. It retails around £56.99, and I've got it here just before I do my build in it, just so we can take a look at it while it's empty. And my first impression of this case is that it's definitely very lightweight. When I was taking it out of the box and things and sort of unpacking it, it was really easy to move around, and this is because it only weighs about 8 kilograms. So obviously that means that it's probably going to be made of sort of thinner metals than you would get on a more expensive case, which isn't too bad. Like I mentioned, you can move it around a bit more easily. So the dimensions on this case, the width is 205 millimeters, you've got a height of 486 millimeters and a depth of 503 millimeters. So that puts it at being sort of a mid-tower size. I think aesthetically it definitely doesn't look bad at all. There's nothing about it that's hugely unique that makes it stand out. It is sort of a very classic square black box design. On the front here you've got this very big grille, and that contains two 120mm RGB fans. If we turn it round to the side, you can see that it has this acrylic side panel, and a lot of cases now are moving towards using tempered glass. So obviously this is a budget case, so acrylic is a cheaper material, so they have opted to use acrylic. The only problem that I find with acrylic is that it's very easy to scratch, and as you can see, I've actually already managed to mark it, and I've tried to be really careful with this, but it just takes one slip and then it's scratched forever. So yeah, it's definitely something to consider when you're looking at cases, is acrylic versus tempered glass. Going with the RGB theme on this case, so you've got the two fans in the front, the RGB. You also get a very nice RGB LED strip along the PSU shroud, and it's not something that I would expect on a more budget case, so it's quite nice to see. The PSU shroud itself also has a little cutout in it, and that's sort of, I guess, so you can show off what PSU you're using in there. It's something a little bit different. A lot of PSU shrouds completely cover your power supply, so it sort of allows you to show off what power supply you've got in there. There's also reasonably minimal branding on this case. So obviously it's made by GameMax, but all they've done is they put a little badge on the PSU shroud next to the cutout that sort of shows it's made by GameMax. There's nothing too over the top, because I have seen one of their other cases that my colleague reviewed, and it had a giant white GameMax lettering along the PSU shroud, and for me that's definitely not a style I would like, so I like that on this case they've gone for much more minimal branding. The overall build quality on this case is definitely pretty decent. I mean, it is a budget case, but there's nothing on it that overall screams, oh my god, cheap. It's made of a sort of painted black steel, so like I said, it is very lightweight, so the sort of side panels do have like a little bit of flex to them, but it's definitely not bad at all. And then this the front panel is actually made of plastic, but you wouldn't really know it because they've done quite a good job of making it sort of look like that brushed aluminium, and I definitely don't think it sort of stands out as being overly plasticky and nasty looking. So yeah, I think the overall build quality is pretty decent, and there's no sort of horrible sharp edges on there as well that you're going to cut your hands on. Everything seems pretty well finished. So when it comes to the front of this case, the I/O ports, you get two USB 3 ports. I would like to see a few more. You get a microphone jack, a headphone jack, and then there's the reset button on the side. On top you've got a big power button, and there's also a button that allows you to switch between the different settings on the LED lighting. You've got this very big grille at the front, and hopefully that's going to mean there's lots and lots of airflow getting through into this case, and it cools quite well. You've also got some like grooves down the side here, so I'm hoping that we do get a good amount of airflow in this case, and it keeps everything nice and cool. So as you can see, I've now pulled off the front of this case. It's definitely quite difficult to remove. It takes quite a bit of a strong tug, but you also have to be quite careful at the same time because all of those IO cables are actually attached to this front panel. So that is definitely a little bit of a downer, and it means that if you go to pull this off, you sort of, like I've had to, you have to take the side panel off, and sort of, if you've got everything cable managed, you have to sort of undo all that to make sure you don't pull too hard on those cables when you try and take it off. So yeah, I would like to see that maybe it was like mounted on the case itself, like you get on a lot of other cases. But I guess being a budget case, it just means you have to be a little bit careful. So I've pulled the front of it off so I can show you that you've actually got a fan filter in here. It just sort of clips off. I'm trying to be careful because of those cables. Right, there we go. So yeah, this is the fan filter, so you're basically going to stop all the dust getting in there, and it is definitely a little bit awkward to get to if you want to clean it on a regular basis. I like to clean my fan filters on a regular basis, so it's good that it does have one, but it's definitely a little bit annoying that it's difficult to get to. Up on the top of this case, you get another big grill, but this grill doesn't actually have a dust filter, and you can't put any fans in the top of this case either. So I think that even though it might let a little bit of heat out sort of passively, it's definitely going to probably let quite a bit of dust in because it's just going to sit on top of the case and just fall all on top of your lovely components. So that's definitely a little bit downer. I would have liked to see either a dust filter or maybe for GAMEMAX to make this case a little bit taller and allow you to put a couple of 120mm fans in the top, or even allow you to put a radiator in the top. On the bottom of this case, you've got 4 plastic feet, and each one of these feet has a little rubber pad on the bottom, and they do quite a good job of stopping it slipping around on your desk. What I have noticed though is that they do seem to leave little marks all over my white unit that I've got here. I mean, it's not too annoying, so obviously day to day you're not going to be moving your case around, but it is definitely something I've noticed, so I thought that it would be good to mention it. Also on the bottom you get a dust filter for your power supply. It's reasonably easy to slide in and out, and it's definitely something that's good to see, especially on a budget case, because it's something you don't have to add in, but obviously dust hurts your components, so it's definitely a plus. So if I now turn this case round to the side panels are pretty reasonably easy to take off. I've already removed the side panel on the back just because I had to do it to get that front panel off. But I'll just remove the side panel. So yeah, really easy. You get a little handle at the back and they slide off perfectly. I've definitely had cases where the side panels are a lot more difficult to remove. So now we've got it opened up, we can take a closer look at everything inside. So at the back here, you get this 120mm fan, and it is just a normal 3-pin fan, and it is just like a bit random to me because it's a white fan in a black case, and I don't really like how it looks. I think it'd be nicer if they put another RGB fan in the back, or just used a black fan really. The other 2 fans that come in this case are 2 RGB 120mm fans, and because I'm going to be using a all-in-one cooler, this case supports a 240mm radiator in the front, so I'm going to remove these 2 fans, and I'm actually going to switch this rather ugly black and white fan out for one of these much nicer RGB fans. This case has 7 PCIe slots, and they're look like you don't actually have to snap them off, which is good, because I remember budget cases in the past you'd have to sort of like snap them off, and you'd be left with sort of horrible sharp edges, but you just look like you unscrew these, which is definitely a plus. This case also supports you can use a micro ATX motherboard, ATX motherboards, and even ETA ATX motherboards, so you've got plenty of options in there. And you've got 165mm CPU cooler clearance, and you've got plenty of space for a nice big graphics card up to 430mm. And if you are going to be using a big graphics card in this case, you get a little bit of an extra. And to be honest, when I first opened up the accessories, I actually had no idea what this was. I went into the manual, and it turns out that it's actually a GPU support. So it's going to stop your graphics card sagging if you are using a big graphics card. And it just slots into PSG shroud here, and it's definitely not the best looking thing to look at, but it's good that it does come with a budget case, because it's not something that I would expect to get with a case that costs under £60. The front I/O cables are all coated in nice black plastic. This is good to see, as obviously this is a window case, so it's definitely something we've thought about, because if you had a whole load of rainbow cables, it would definitely be a little bit of a downer. You've got this cage here, so obviously that's for your two drive bays, and I think that this cage actually looks removable, so I think I'm going to take out, and that's purely for aesthetics as well, because I think it's going to look a bit nicer if this thing's out of the way. So I think it's quite nice that they've made that removable. And this case has support for, you can have 3 3.5 inch drives and 4 2.5 inch SSDs. So you've got quite a little unique mounting feature, and you can actually put 2 of your 2.5 inch SSDs on the front here so you can see them. I think I'm going to do that with my SSD because I think it's quite smart. It's definitely a little bit different, and it's going to help sort of the overall build. I think it will look a little bit nicer. If I flip it around, then we can take a look at where the other drives go. So you've got the 2 other mounting points here for your other 2 SSDs. So like I said, you can have up to 4 2.5 inch, but you do only get 1 tray. So if you wanted to use this other slot, you'd have to buy another tray separately. But yeah, you can either use it in whichever one you want, or buy another tray and you can use that second slot. The 3.5 inch drives go in these rather sort of, you get a very basic, just try to get one of them out. There we go. You get a very basic bright blue hard drive tray. You get 2 of those, and then your third hard drive actually has got mounting holes to go on the bottom of the case. So you just mount that straight on the bottom. So yeah, space for 3 3.5 inch drives and 4 2.5 inch SSDs. So I think that's quite a decent amount of support. Obviously a budget case, so I can't imagine there's people out there that have got a whole stack of like 7 different SSDs in RAID configuration that they want to get in this case. So yeah, I think it's definitely enough support for a someone who's going to be purchasing a budget case. Also around the back here, you can see that you actually get a fan controller, and that's not something I would expect to see on a more budget case, but it works to control the RGB lighting and the PWM fans. As you can see, when it comes to cable management options, it's definitely not too bad. You've got plenty of holes here to thread cables through. There's plenty of space here for the 8-pin. You've got another slot here. You've got one that comes up through the power supply shroud. Even though they don't have grommets, they are nicely rounded off, so there's no sharp edges that are going to damage your cables on there. And when it comes to the depth, I think it's pretty standard really. I think that's probably about 3 or 4 centimeters. So it might be a little bit of a squeeze for the 24 pin. I mean, it's definitely going to fit, but it's definitely going to be a little bit tight, and it's definitely not small, but it's not big either. I would say it's just about average really when it comes to cable management space. But I do like the fact that you get a really big space here in front of the power supply. So that's great for sort of bending cables around and getting them into a good position, or even if you've got a little bit of extra length on the cables, you can sort of neatly store them away in there and you haven't got them crushed between the side panel and the back of the motherboard tray. So yeah, overall it looks to be a pretty decent case at the moment. Obviously it's got a few little things, but of course it is a budget case. So we can now fast forward in time through the power of editing and see how well I got on building in this case, and see how well it performs when it comes to temperature and noise. So I've now got the GAMEMAX Kallis all set up. I'll just start off by talking about the RGB LEDs. As you can see, they're now all lit up. You've got 7 different static colours. I'll just scroll through them. Then there's this breathing mode that sort of slowly cycles between all the different colours. And then this rather horrific strobing mode that I'm definitely not a fan of. I do think the RGB LEDs are a nice feature though, and it's not something that I would expect to see in a more budget case. So obviously I've put in all of my components. Here is a full list of what I used. And in the end I opted to use an FSP rather budget air cooler, and this was because I wanted to make sure that I tested the fans that came with this case, and I didn't want to remove them in order to put in the 240mm all-in-one water cooler that I was going to use. And also, with it being a budget case, I thought most people purchasing this case would probably be using an air cooler instead of an all-in-one water cooler. I managed to remove the drive bay bracket in the end, and that was purely thought for aesthetic reasons, but I definitely think this case does look a little bit better without that sort of hanging there in the top right hand corner. The graphics card is held up pretty well by the PCIe screws, but I did want to put in this GPU bracket, and it's not that this graphics card needs it, but I just wanted to sort of show what it looks like and found out how easy it was to install. And unfortunately, because of the heat pipes on this graphics card, I couldn't actually get it to fit, and there is no way in order to adjust it to get it to fit either. So that's definitely something to think about if you do want to use the GPU bracket, is that it's only going to be able to work with certain graphics cards. I mentioned that when this case is empty that I wanted to put my SSD in the front because I thought it would look a little bit nicer, and I thought it was quite a unique feature of this case. But unfortunately, the SATA power cable that I have on my power supply doesn't actually fit behind the SSD, so I can't power it, and therefore I had to mount my SSD on the back of the motherboard tray on one of the brackets provided. So I think that this means this case really actually only has one dedicated SSD bracket, unless you count the 3.5-inch drive bays, because you either need an adapter for your power supply or you're going to have to buy an extra bracket if you want to mount them on the back of the motherboard tray. However, I did find that the one bracket that was supplied with the case worked really well to mount my SSD on, and I definitely prefer it over the sort of spring-loaded brackets you can get with some cases. While I was building in this case, I did notice that a couple of the holes that were drilled for the motherboard standoff were a little bit sharp and unfinished. It was only a couple of them though, but I didn't notice it initially, so I thought that it would be good to mention it. I think overall for a budget case though, it is pretty well finished, and it's better than I would expect. When it came to the ease of installing parts in this case, it was very straightforward. You get a little bag of screws, every screw you could ever need. You get some wire cable ties, you get quite a basic user manual, and I found that the Kallis is a really good size to work in. You've got plenty of space at the top to get the 8-pin power in. All the holes to fit cables through are really well positioned, and you have a good clearance above the PSU shroud to reach the front panel headers. The best thing about this case definitely has to be performance. Like I said, I'm only using a reasonably cheap CPU cooler and just the fans that come with the case, and not only is it surprisingly quiet, everything stays reasonably cool as well. I mean, you can definitely hear the fans, but they are far from annoying on full speed. And I've been playing games on this PC, and I've stress tested it using Ada64, and the temps max out at around 75 for the CPU and around 65 for the GPU, and then the CPU idles around 25 and the GPU idles around 35, so that's some really good temps. This is only a budget case, but it definitely does a good job, and just imagine what it would do if you could put 2 extra fans in the top. I've turned the case around so that we can talk about cable management. I found this case pretty decent to cable manage. Don't judge my attempt too much because I know that it's far from perfect. The cable tie holes to thread cable ties through, I would like to see a few more of those, but it is adequate to do a decent job in a short amount of time. I really liked the space in front of the power supply. I think it's really good for putting extra length of cables, and it's definitely going to come in handy for people that are using a non-modular power supply. My only annoyance when it came to putting in all the cables is that I had to use a Molex cable, and that is because the fan control in this case requires power from an FDD connector, and with the Seasonic power supply that I'm using, that needs a Molex cable. And I didn't even recognise the connection first. I definitely showed my age here. I thought that I might actually need an adapter, and I would much rather that case manufacturers used SATA power to power fan controllers and RGB lighting on a case instead of these older connections, and that's just to save on cable management space. Overall, I think this case is pretty sound. It's definitely not perfect, but as it's a budget case, I think it can definitely get away with it. It's good to look at, it performs well, and it's reasonably easy to build in. So I think it's definitely a case to consider if you're on a budget. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more from Kitgo, hit the subscribe button.